everybody, how's it going? This is John and you're watching CineMania24x7, the channel dedicated to movies, music, physical media, books, video games and pop culture. So, the Pierce Brosnan Bond movies are a very interesting era of Bond films. This is coming exactly after the Timothy Dalton era, which did not last long unfortunately, and the fatigue of the Roger Moore era as well. This era has its own plus points and negative points as well, but the problem being sometimes I believe it could not live up to the potential that it had actually established with the first film. And today we're going to explore this very topic in detail by dissecting each and every movie one by one. Please subscribe to my channel as it helps me make more new videos, and this year is going to be a very good year for CineMania24x7 as we may hit 2000 subscribers on this channel by December. So yeah, let's begin the video on a high note. To give you a little bit of background on how this entire drama started, well, the Pierce Brosnan Bond movies came exactly after the Dalton and the Moore movies. Both of these movies, or let's say these actors, had movies that are already causing the decline of the franchise in ways, because if you remember the 1985 film A View to a Kill, which was the final Roger Moore Bond movie, that movie wasn't exactly any good. People have their own objections with it. I own the film on DVD, but I still like it for whatever it is. When we talk of the Timothy Dalton Bond movies, well, there's a different kind of consensus. The Living Daylights is a very enjoyable movie in my understanding, but the second film, License to Kill, is a little divisive, although the critical reception on that movie has just improved over the years, and I certainly believe that the movie is miles better than what people remember. That was not the case when we talk of the box office reception. There's a big reason why the movie sort of caused the Bond franchise to be stuck in limbo for almost a decade, give or take 3-4 years. In retrospect, these two movies look very good considering Mr. Roger Moore has already passed away, and it seems very happy to see him on screen one last time playing the character, and also Timothy Dalton's License to Kill, which should have gotten more than it actually deserved. Now, Pierce Brosnan takes the helm of the franchise in 1995 with the first movie GoldenEye, and holds the same till another decade at least. Till 2002, that is Die Another Day. In all these 4 movies that we've had in the last 30 years now, because the movie is almost decades old, I want to talk about each of these movies one by one and understand where did things go wrong or right. We talk of the first movie, GoldenEye, which released immediately after License to Kill, almost a decade later, where this is the first film where we see that the Soviet Union has collapsed and Russia is now a land of opportunity, as stated by one of the characters in the movie as well. This is the first movie to star Pierce Brosnan as the iconic spy, along with Judi Dench, who plays M, a female character in the decades-long history of the franchise. The movie tells the story of Bond, who is trying to investigate a crime syndicate, unaware his friend is also involved this time, and the movie is much more personal than any Bond movie would otherwise be in the past. Now, don't get me wrong, this movie has aged very well in many places. Very, very well. The soundtrack is absolutely a banger. The theme song, still beautiful to hear. The Bond girls, top notch. Absolutely top notch. Pierce Brosnan as James Bond, very well acted, and I cannot even believe that this guy is almost in his early 40s by the time this film rolled out. But yeah, that's what it was. So GoldenEye literally set the expectations of how the Pierce Brosnan Bond era will look like. Cold, suave, calculating, and very, very stylish. Absolutely stylish. But this is also one of the biggest reasons why this franchise could never become so big, or at least as iconic as the Sean Connery era or the Roger Moore era, at least in the initial phases, because GoldenEye set the bar so high for the other films that many of the films failed to stand up to that level, although those movies did have their own moments, which we will discuss in the next section of the video. So the first film was GoldenEye, and it genuinely became a very good Bond movie in years, at least as far as the critical reception is concerned. Now this is the second movie of the series, which is called Tomorrow Never Dies, which has a slightly absurd plot. You have a media mogul who's a little cracked in the head. He wants China and Britain to be at war with each other. He has this invisible submarine that is not visible on the radar, and he's apparently nuking both the sides, making them believe that both are at war with each other. And now Bond is supposed to stop this guy. So there's a Chinese agent, there is a Flame, Bond's Flame, who manages to be the villain's wife. She unfortunately dies in the movie. Sad, but yeah, a very shocking death, the way I see it. But this particular film did not have the spark as the previous one. Now, don't get me wrong. Tomorrow Never Dies was sort of released at the same time as James Cameron's Titanic, and you know how big that movie is in terms of the impact it created back in 1997 and even decades later as well. It is heralded as one of the best films ever made. So you know you're competing with one of the best films ever made, yet the film stands at number 2 on the box office and still does well. But the spark that GoldenEye had, the charm that GoldenEye had, this wasn't here in this one. The movie looked very different. It did not have the sense of tension or the suspense that the previous one had, but it was still a good watch. At least in parts and bits, you can still feel that the actor Pierce Brosnan played the character really well, and the sequences were also holding up. There were action set pieces that looked absolutely fantastic, even after all these years they do so. About the Bond girls, I'm only convinced that Paris Carver, the lady who played it, I'm not able to remember her name, she did the role very well. But if you talk about Michelle Yeoh, I am not exactly convinced that she was as good as the previous Bond girls. She has her own skills, don't get me wrong, but her part should have been a little more meatier, the way I see it. So we are now concluding the second movie of the series. It could have been better, but it still had the charm. Now the third movie, The World Is Not Enough, is an evidence that even this third movie was not enough. The third movie in the series, The World Is Not Enough, essentially takes us to a much more deeper and much more sinister plot history. So there is a guy who gets killed in the MI6 premises. James Bond ends up apprehending or nearly apprehending a woman assassin who was apparently operating on the quirks, or let's say the whims of the villain, but we don't know who he is. And of course, he's also suspended from duty as well. He makes it a personal vendetta, goes behind the daughter of the person who died in MI6, unaware that there is a massive conspiracy going on inside. Now, don't get me wrong. This movie was at least better than Tomorrow Never Dies in many respects. The theme song was great. The opening sequence was genuinely shocking. Third, the action set pieces were much more better than Tomorrow Never Dies in certain places. But what I lacked is the idea that the Bond girls this time were not exactly good. Now, don't get me wrong. This is one of the only Bond movies that I remember in the last so many years that I've seen James Bond films where you have one of the best Bond girls on screen and also one of the worst Bond girls on screen. I'm talking about Dennis Richards and Sophie Marceau. Both of these ladies shared the same screen at the same time in the same movie. And yet, Sophie Marceau turns out to be much more iconic, not to mention the reason why. But yes, she was an iconic villain and an iconic Bond girl as well. The idea that she's involved with the villain, there's a certain twist involved, completely beyond me. And the character Renard. I can't believe that this is the same guy who played Gaz in The Full Monty, one of the most iconic British films ever made. And this guy apparently has a bullet stuck in his head that hasn't even moved inside, so he's become some sort of a superhuman. He doesn't feel pain. I mean, are we even watching a James Bond movie at this point? I'm not sure. But yet, this is the movie. The World Is Not Enough certainly turned out to be a great watch. It has its own moments, but I genuinely believe that yes, the idea that two Bond girls with two such different personalities and different rankings at the same time existed in the same film did not click as well as I expected. But nonetheless, that is The World Is Not Enough, and now we move to the final movie of the series. A movie that is not exactly a very good one, but a pretty divisive one, depending upon how you look at it and what you look at it in terms of. So, we now move to the final James Bond movie starring Pierce Brosnan, that is Die Another Day. Now, Brosnan was supposed to apparently make another movie with himself as the titular character, but that never happened because 4 years later you had Daniel Craig's Casino Royale pop in. But yeah, that movie has its own problems, we can discuss that some other day. But when we talk of the movie Die Another Day, this is a weird film. Essentially, it just seems like the director, Lee Tamahori, essentially picked up all the characters who had become successful in their own individual ventures. Rick Yoon is also part of this movie. The very guy who played Johnny Tran in the first Fast and Furious movie, he is the villain this time. At least, a side villain. And then there is an entire idea of Bond being trapped in North Korea. He gets rescued. There is a plot involving some guy who is planning to harvest the energy of the sun to do some weird stuff. Turns out he was actually someone else, and he becomes someone else due to plastic surgery, which is not believable at all. Then there is Madonna's title track, which is a genuinely good one. She even makes an appearance in the movie, if I'm not mistaken. That's also good. The face-off sequences between Bond and the character that played Gustav Graves was genuinely very powerful, and it seemed like one of the best action sequences in terms of hand-to-hand combat that they orchestrated for this one. Now, Rosamund Pike as a Bond girl is divisive because she turns out to be someone who's actually on the villain's side and not exactly on Bond's side, as the movie would want you to believe. Halle Berry as a character is pretty much wasted in the film. She doesn't seem to have much of an appeal that the other Bond girls ever had. They tried to create an iconic moment from 1962 because they took the movie to the Caribbean for a short while of time in the movie. That never exactly clicked well in my understanding. But nonetheless, that is Die Another Day. This was the movie that essentially closed the lid on the Brosnan movies forever. I can attribute a lot of things here. There's bad CGI. Sometimes the action sequences are a little choppy. The idea that a car literally vanishes and James Bond can use it around is a little too absurd to be believed. At least the 1960s James Bond movies are a little more believable, even though they were not pulling off anything as absurd as this. The movie relies too much on technology at times, and the villain doesn't exactly feel like a very powerful one. Of course, there's one scene where the villain kills his father, a North Korean commander apparently, if I'm not mistaken. But that is with Die Another Day, and this genuinely happens to be one of my least favorite Bond movies in the wider saga and the Brosnan saga as well. We now come to the conclusion of the video. So in retrospect, when I look at all these four movies, GoldenEye was the best one of them, followed by maybe The World Is Not Enough, then Tomorrow Never Dies, and finally Die Another Day, in the sequence as I would like to put it. GoldenEye probably set the bar so high for the movies that none of the other movies could ever match its legacy or the impact that it managed to create, and that became one of the biggest problems with the Brosnan Bond era. They could have made movies equal to or even better than GoldenEye in terms of quality, but again, the quality particularly lies in the eyes of the beholder or the person who is looking at it. You might have a different opinion on this, and I'm very okay and open to listening to all of them down in the comment section. Do tell me about your favorite Brosnan Bond movie, and let's see what you have to think. So that puts the video to an end the way I see it. The Brosnan Bond deserved a much better farewell, contrary to the one that we got anyway. So yeah, that's the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching my channel. Please subscribe to my channel and also keep buying films on physical media. That's the best and the most amazing way to protect movies for long. Stay safe, bye bye, and Godspeed, and see you in the next video next week.